We all know the classic story of Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. A poor, impoverished boy called Charlie Bucket discovers a golden ticket in a Wonka bar where he goes on an adventure of a lifetime to Willy Wonka's Chocolate Factory, a wonderful and often terrifying realm of pure imagination, where Gene Wilder as the eccentric candy maker really captured our hearts and also gave us the heebie-jeebies too. Make no mistake about it, the 1971 movie is a beloved classic. However, the story's creator, Roald Dahl, actively despised the movie, so much so he even tinkered with the idea to campaign against it upon its release, with this author-to-movie adaptation feud making the Stephen King Shining conflict look like a Sunday school picnic. And what's even more confusing is Dahl himself would even work on the movie. So how did this bitter feud start? Well, in today's episode of Weird Tales of Pop Culture, we're going to go inside the video store and explore the all-time classic Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory to try and understand its ugly battle between its creator, Roald Dahl. So, let's check it out. It goes without saying that Roald Dahl is one of the most influential children's authors of all time. Born in Wales 1916 to Norwegian immigrants, he would serve in the Royal Air Force during World War II. It was also during the 40s that he would start to write books for both adults and children. The first children's book he wrote was The Gremlins, and it was published in 1943, with the intention of being a Disney movie, but that didn't happen. And throughout his career, Dahl would go on to write many classic works of children's literature, including James and the Giant Peach, Matilda, The Witches, The BFG, The Twits, and of course, today's subject, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. It was the early 60s when Dahl started conceiving the idea of what would become Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. He got this idea from his own childhood memories in the 1920s, when rival chocolate companies Cadbury and Rowntree's would use children in Dahl's local community of Derbyshire as taste testers for their latest chocolate treats. In other words, to see the children's reactions, to see what chocolates did and didn't work. Oh, and chocolate may seem like an innocent part of childhood innocence, but these two chocolate companies were pretty hardcore when it came to who could make the best chocolates, with the companies engaging in spying and corporate espionage. No, I'm serious here. Apparently both companies would send spies to the factory of their chocolate rivals, even going as far as disguising themselves as employees in order to get their hands on their rivals' trade secrets. So yeah, this bizarre, dark underworld of chocolate making is pretty much what led to the creation of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. So Dahl, of course, would start creating his Charlie and the Chocolate Factory book. The first version of the story had some changes though, as the Oompa Loompas were originally described as, quote, pygmies from Africa. And my favourite is Mike TV's original name in this original version was actually Herpes. Wow. So, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory is published in 1964, and it would go on to be considered one of the most influential and celebrated children's books of all time. The movie adaptation would come to be because director Mel Stewart's daughter was a fan of the book and really wanted her father to make a movie version of it, a notion he clearly took seriously. Stewart took the idea to producer David L. Wolper. The two filmmakers then, interestingly, took this idea of a Willy Wonka movie to food company, the Quaker Oats Company, and tried to convince them to buy the rights of the Charlie and the Chocolate Factory book. So, why Quaker Oats? Well, because the company can also release a line of Willy Wonka themed candy bars, with the movie acting as an advertisement for this new candy bar range. Boom! Money in the bank. And naturally, Quaker Oats agreed. Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory would also be picked up for distribution by Paramount Pictures, and so now the movie was in production, with the filming taking place in Munich, Germany. Now, when it came to writing the script, the production felt they should turn to the author of the original story, Roald Dahl himself, who, although was a children's author, had also dabbled in script writing, having written the scripts for the James Bond movie You Only Live Twice and Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. And so Dahl agreed to join the movie production and write a movie script version of his story. Now, pretty much from the get-go, Dahl was in a pretty rocky relationship with the production of the movie, as Dahl originally didn't even hand in a script per se, but a plot outline featuring elements of his book. I guess this was a case of, well, the movie is based on my book, so here it is. It's all there. Here's my book in all its glory. Use that. But the filmmakers insisted on a script, and it is said that the script that Dahl eventually did hand in was unfinished, and required extensive rewrites. Now, there's always going to be a few changes between book and movie, namely the situation with the Oompa Loompas. Because of the civil rights movement and racial sensitivity, it was decided to change the Oompa Loompas from African pygmies to mythical beings from a faraway place, with them spouting orange faces and green hair. However, one of the very first changes that was made, and one that really drove Roald Dahl up the wall, was changing the title from Charlie and the Chocolate Factory to Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. Dahl thought that the title should stay Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, as it's Charlie's story, his journey. But Quaker Oats, who were funding the movie and basically had the last say, wanted to name the movie Willy Wonka as a way of promoting their Willy Wonka chocolate bars. Basically, they weren't thinking of the story, but economic sales. Which, look, I guess you can't blame them. They are a business. But you see, that's the clash. Roald Dahl's creative integrity versus this company's goal of making this movie so they can sell product. And so, ultimately, the movie was given the title of Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. And from there, it got worse. Both Dahl and director Mel Stewart and producer David L. Wolper agreed that the movie should be a musical. But rather than using any of the songs Dahl wrote in the book, the production of the movie would create entirely new songs, specifically for the film, with the songs and music written by Leslie Bricusse and Anthony Newley. Incidentally, both of whom wrote the music for Dr. Dolittle and the James Bond song Goldfinger. This further angered Dahl, as he felt the songs in Willy Wonka were too sappy and overly whimsical, going against his original songs which had dark tones. He particularly, for some reason, hated the song The Candyman and lobbied hard to get it removed out of the movie. So I guess Dahl wasn't going to be singing along to cheer up Charlie anytime soon. That wasn't the only thing that Dahl tried to get vetoed from the movie. Another scene he really didn't like and wanted removed was the scene where Charlie and Grandpa Joe drink some of the fizzy lifting drink and start floating, with the movie showing that Charlie and Grandpa Joe do have a bit of a mischievous side. I guess that went against Dahl's vision, as it was a sequence entirely made up for the movie. And I guess I can understand Dahl being annoyed, as the whole point of the book is Charlie is a good boy who follows all the rules, and that's why he comes out victorious. But in the movie, he still gets rewarded even though he broke the rules. But it could be argued that the movie is more realistic, as children do have a misbehaving side to them, so it makes Charlie less perfect and more interesting and more like an actual kid. Yeah, look, I can see it from both sides. However, things would reach boiling point when it came to the casting of Willy Wonka himself. Without a doubt, the most pivotal part of the movie. Basically, if the casting of Willy Wonka doesn't work, then you don't have a movie. Dahl insisted that Wonka should be played by either Spike Milligan or Peter Sellers. However, the powers that be behind the movie had other ideas, and cast Gene Wilder in the role, which left Dahl fuming, and probably thinking, what? That wimpy, neurotic guy from the producers is my Willy Wonka? Probably. Now, without a doubt, Wilder's portrayal of Willy Wonka has become beloved. I mean, everyone loves this performance, myself included, and it really does give the movie its heart. However, Dahl wasn't a fan, finding Gene Wilder's performance to be pretentious and lacked a certain British eccentricity that he felt the character needed. Oh, come on! You can't go dissing Gene Wilder like that. I'm pretty sure there's a law against that or something. It's like Dahl had a particular image in his head of what his creation is, and Gene Wilder didn't fit that bill. But Wilder obviously worked, as his performance of Willy Wonka has become so beloved. It goes back to this conflict of Dahl's vision and creative integrity versus what would work on the screen. Is it worth going against Dahl's original perception if it delivers a better product? Movie-wise, of course. There was clearly a creative clash between Dahl and the Willy Wonka filmmakers. Dahl felt the movie strayed too far away from his original vision, with now more attention in the movie on Willy Wonka than there was Charlie, and he felt the cautionary tale aspect of his original book also got lost in this movie adaptation. And so, just like that, Dahl left the production and walked out of the movie, completely turned his back on it. In order to complete the script and make rewrites the filmmakers felt needed to be made, producer David L. Wolpner hired scriptwriter David Seltzer to make rewrites. Now, although several years later he would go on to write the script for The Omen, back then he was a fairly new and inexperienced writer. He basically wasn't a big name, yet. And when it came to releasing the movie, they felt they needed Dahl's name to be attached to it in order to maintain credibility and momentum. So Seltzer's work went uncredited, in favour of all credit going to Roald Dahl. But producer David L. Wolper was like, hey, that's not a problem. To make up for that, I'll finance the movie for one of your scripts. Just give me one of your scripts that you want to turn into a movie and I will fund it personally so we can get it made. Which he did 1 year later with the movie One is a Lonely Number, which of course was written by Seltzer and even directed by Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory's director, Mel Stewart. In fact, David Seltzer kind of saved the movie, because originally in the movie's ending scene, when we see Willy Wonka, Grandpa Joe and Charlie fly away in the Wonkavator, the movie was to end with Grandpa Joe yelling out, "Yippee!" Oh god, terrible. It was felt that this needed an urgent change, which it did. During the writing process, Seltzer was so creatively exhausted, he retreated to a cabin in the middle of nowhere in Maine. And the cabin didn't even have a phone. There was, however, a phone attached to a tree outside the cabin, and Seltzer just so happened to be walking past this tree when it rung. He answered it to a frantic Mel Stewart, who said, "You've got to come up with a new ending, and fast!" Which is where Seltzer came up with the powerful and haunting line of,
"Don't forget what happened to the man who suddenly got everything he always wanted.
What happened?
He lived happily ever after."
Brilliant stuff. Now, despite going on to becoming a beloved classic as mentioned, and one of the greatest children's movies of all time, Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory didn't have a spectacular cinematic run, only making a very disappointing $4 million on a $3 million budget. And ever since its release, Roald Dahl's bad blood with the movie would only continue to grow, with him not being shy of speaking his true feelings of the film, often revealing he didn't like working on the movie and really didn't like the final product, describing the movie's director, Mel Stewart, as having no talent or flair whatsoever, and he also found the movie to be crummy. In fact, upon the movie's release, according to whynow.co.uk, Dahl was against the movie so much he considered to campaign against it. Yep, he was willing to go out of his way and destroy the movie entirely, by the sounds of it. But, it really didn't matter, as Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory wasn't exactly bringing in the numbers in the box office. It was a box office disappointment. And Quaker Oats Wonka chocolate bars didn't particularly sell well either, so it was kind of a failed experiment. In fact, things only got worse with the chocolates, as the Wonka chocolate bars had to be recalled due to a problem with the ingredients in the chocolate, which caused them to melt too easily, almost making it sound like a weird chocolate experiment that Willy Wonka in the story himself could have created. Man, this franchise could not catch a break.
You get nothing. You lose. Good day, sir.
However, during the mid-70s, Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory's popularity would really pick up thanks to several Thanksgiving TV broadcasts, which would lead to its eventual cult status. Yep, just like the Wizard of Oz before it, Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory would have a second chance with finding its fame and success thanks to TV broadcasts. In 1972, 1 year after the release of the movie, Dahl wrote a sequel book called Charlie and the Great Glass Elevator, and Dahl made it explicitly clear that he will deny any movie studio or producer from turning this caper into a movie too. Nope, no one is going to be seeing Charlie and the Glass Elevator on the big screen. Now, it's said that Dahl wrote Charlie and the Glass Elevator because of kids writing to him asking for another Charlie and the Chocolate Factory book. But I've always had a feeling, and it's just a feeling, that he might had written it to stick it to the production of Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. Like he's saying, ha, good luck trying to turn this into a movie, you'll never get your hands on it. But once again, that's just my own little theory. In fact, Dahl himself supposedly said that the story of Charlie and the Glass Elevator is too bizarre to be turned into a movie. And yes, the story of this sequel is pretty far out there, where Charlie and Willy Wonka encounter a hotel in space, in a story which features aliens, and a space monster that eats people, and a subplot about the grandparents being de-aged, thanks to a de-aging pill that Wonka had created. But the pill goes too far, with one of the grandparents going into, quote, negative age, and the story also features the president. It makes you wonder if Charlie and the Glass Elevator was knowingly or unknowingly like a counter-retaliation to the movie, especially considering Roald Dahl would have written it not too long after the whole Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory movie ordeal. To make something so insane and surreal, it could never be made into a movie. Well, at least not back then anyway. With this entry sounding more like an episode of Doctor Who than an actual sequel to Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Regardless, the bad blood and tension between Dahl and the Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory movie didn't ease in time, with it being suggested he held a grudge against the movie right up until his death, and his experience in Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory made him lose trust and interest in the film industry, and he would never work on a movie ever again, although he would still write for TV. However, in 1989, 3 made-for-TV movies based on his books were broadcast, in the form of the BFG, Danny the Champion of the World, which starred a younger Jeremy Irons and Robbie Coltrane, and a wartime thriller called Breaking Point. So could it be that Dahl was starting to ease up and allow people to make adaptations of his stories again? By the late 80s and early 90s, in the short few remaining years he had left, could the bad blood between him and the Willy Wonka movie now be a thing of the past? Well, finally in 1990, after 19 years, another Roald Dahl story would be adapted into a theatrical movie, with the Jim Henson-produced The Witches. So now maybe with the passing of time, Dahl may have mellowed out when it came to adaptations being made based on his books. Well, for the most part, Dahl did seem a bit more positive here. He was happy with the casting of Angelica Houston as the Grand High Witch. However, the movie's ending is where we get problems. If you haven't seen The Witches in a while, here's a quick rundown. In the story of The Witches, the Grand High Witch turns the protagonist of the story, a young boy called Luke, into a mouse. And in Dahl's original story, Luke remains a mouse forevermore. However, for the movie version, Henson had 2 endings filmed. One where, just like the book, Luke remains a mouse, and a happier, more Hollywoodized ending, where one of the witches turns good and zaps Luke back into being a human. Before the movie's release, Dahl saw an early cut of The Witches, of which had the original ending of Luke remaining a mouse. And it said that Dahl was so delighted with the movie, he was brought to tears. However, when it came time to releasing the movie, Henson opted for the happier ending where Luke becomes a boy again. Look, I can't see why this ending was chosen. I think sometimes what works in books doesn't necessarily work on film. And it probably would have left audiences unsatisfied if our main character was stuck as a mouse forevermore, and thus having a much lower quality of life. And so, needless to say, upon seeing this new ending, Dahl was furious, and apparently even felt duped, and demanded his name to be removed from The Witcher's credits. Yep, he completely wanted to cut ties with this movie altogether. And once again, even thought about campaigning against the movie. I mean, all this talk about campaigning against what is essentially kids' movies. I feel like there's an irony that a theme in a lot of Roald Dahl's books is mean and or angry adults whom have lost what it means to be children or have childlike innocence and want to tear down children's joy and happiness. And now you have Dahl himself, whom with his campaigning against movies that children clearly loved, is kind of doing just that. Non-intentional, of course, and I'm sure he had a sense of justice, but still. And so, at the age of 74, Roald Dahl would pass away in November 1990, leaving behind an everlasting legacy of wonderful stories. There's no denying that Roald Dahl was a genius who did have a love of children and was able to communicate with them. And so, he was able to touch the hearts of so many people's childhoods, and the words and sentences he put together to tell his tales will live on forever. His legacy will never end. It's definitely a love and passion he had for the craft of storytelling to lead him to tell these wonderful stories, which would become loved all around the world. But it's also this love and passion which also made him at odds with the movie adaptations of his works. We may love these movies based on his books and be okay with their changes, but to Dahl, it seems like they were a betrayal, something that took away the meaning of his stories and went against them. This also makes me wonder, what would Dahl think of the adaptations of his works that have come out since his passing? Just what on earth would he have thought of Tim Burton's Charlie and the Chocolate Factory? Yes, it was more faithful to his story, but clearly not executed as well as the 1971 movie. Or even that recent Wonka movie, which isn't even based on any of his stories. To me, it's all about understanding the two different mediums between books and movies, and just coming to terms with the fact that there always will be changes between the two. And sometimes that's okay. It's okay to have different versions and different variations, as long as it doesn't deviate too much. Regardless, the works of Roald Dahl will always be celebrated. He opened up his heart to pure imagination, and it's this imagination that made the world fall in love with his works. It sounds like Roald Dahl was an artist and a genius who was very protective of his work and didn't like his work being changed or meddled with. And it makes sense, as his books and his stories were his babies. But I think sometimes when translating that medium onto the big screen, changes are always going to be inevitable. And I think that some authors can come to terms with that, and then you have some that have difficulties with it. And to be fair, there have been some occasions where movie adaptations based on books have greatly gone against the books for the worst. But on the flip side of that coin, there have been some movies that have been made that actually made the original stories they're based on better, like Jaws. I think the best way to go into this situation is to accept both the original books and movie adaptations to be their own identity. And it is okay to like both and enjoy both for their own merits. You know, be Ipkiss and the Mask. Anyway, I'm Minty, and the Roald Dahl feud with Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory is a weird tale of pop culture. Yes.